obviously Ukraine is on the West's radar in a way that Syria never has been. And I think it's very difficult to imagine a circumstance unless some kind of peace settlement was sanctified by the Ukrainians that Russia would have any prospect of that. But what I think that the situation with the Arab League does show is that outside the West, this idea of Russia as the great anathema is not necessarily
Yeah.
strong currency. And it might be that if he can win and establish, or not win, but establish a strong position, we might lock him out. But as you mentioned, China and other
Yeah.
authoritarian regimes around the world might row in behind him.
Yeah, the shifts in geopolitics are fascinating and very worrying as well. We have all just touched on the G7. That was an important gathering. World leaders from 17 countries and the EU were meeting in Hiroshima in Japan for the final day of the G7 summit. Topics covered included the war in Ukraine, sanctions against Russia and the threat of China. And Rishi Sunak told leaders at the summit that China was the biggest challenge of our age, and Joe Biden reiterated this message. He said that America should not be entirely reliant on Chinese supply chains.
We're not looking to decouple from China. We're looking to de-risk and diversify our relationship with China. That means taking steps to diversify our supply chains, and we're not dependent on any one country for necessary product. It means resisting economic coercion together and countering harmful practices that hurt our workers.
And of course, President Zelensky was at the G7 summit as well, very much continuing to bang the drum for support for Ukraine. And also, he was very much pushing back against the line coming out of Kremlin, saying that Russian troops have now occupied the city of Bakhmut in the east of the country. David Simmons, how important are these kind of political gatherings, particularly to like a domestic audience, because for many of our listeners, they'll be quite interested in the broader geopolitics, but a lot of people are really focused on things like the cost of living crisis, trying to pay their heating bills. How important are these gatherings?
They're extremely important, partly because they set the tone for the way in which countries interact with each other. So we know that one of the things that's been helpful in reducing the impact of rising energy prices on people in the UK has been the international cooperation that's gone on. We've been purchasing gas from the United States, which has been shipped over to help our supplies. We've also been pumping gas and oil out of the North Sea into the European Union, which has been enormously helpful to countries like Germany that have been historically very reliant on now sanctioned Russian oil and gas. So the fact that countries meet, they cooperate, they set a tone for working together in a friendly way is incredibly important because it sets the context of global trade. And also for those countries with whom we may have a more difficult relationship, it demonstrates that those countries that do have broadly similar values as modern, liberal, free market democracies are willing to work together in pursuit of their interests.
And Kevin, a big theme from this summit has been about the threat of China. I mean, where do you think the UK should position itself on this? Because there's the sort of headline message saying, look, China is a thoroughly bad thing and we've all got to be very aware of China. But then there's a sort of real politics of this. I was at a big business conference this week from the British Chambers of Commerce, and quite a few members there were saying, well, actually, we do a lot of business with China and we get the sort of bigger politics, but we don't want to have, what is a good trading route with China cut off as well when, we're trying to grow the economy. How do you strike the right balance?
Yes, I think a decade or so ago, perhaps we weren't striking the right balance we were, rolling out the red carpet for the president of China visiting the UK at the same time that, our own steel industry is being severely undermined by unfair competition. But on the other hand, I do think President Biden's remarks are correct, and that what we need to do is to make sure that we de-risk the fact that it's inevitable that we have a strong economic ties with China. I mean, 1 in 5 people in the world live in China. It's obviously going to have a hugely enormous impact on the world economy. We're aware of that, but we've seen with the lessons from Russia and the invasion of Ukraine the dangers actually of ignoring the geopolitical importance of your economic ties. So I think it's sensible for the G7 to look at this and to look at what's the right way forward to keep positively engaged with China. We have to trade with China and deal with China, but not become so reliant upon China economically that we get the sorts of risks that will come with that, including the sorts of risks we've seen from Russia and energy prices with the war in Ukraine.
Stephen has messaged us from Cheltenham on the G7. Stephen says, we should not be tying ourselves to America so tightly, and we should be adopting a similar stance to Macron on Taiwan rather than being pushed into conflict with China on American terms. This is not in our citizens' interest. That's Stephen's take from Cheltenham. Munira, of course, Ukraine was very much on the agenda as well, with President Zelensky there. I mean, China's been quite interesting recently by wanting to sort of try and broker some kind of deal. I mean, whether that's even possible, but you know, China is an important player now on the global stage, obviously very, very close to President Putin. How much do you think we should work with China to try and broker some sort of deal to end the conflict?
I think on any sort of peace deal, of course, everybody wants to see peace, but that has got to be a decision for the Ukrainians. And I think we need to follow Ukraine's lead on that. I mean, I think this G7 was an important moment with Zelensky there for the UK and other countries to work together in cooperation and coalition, as we've seen, to provide further military aid. And I think that is welcome. Liberal Democrats have been saying all along that we should be working with our allies in terms of military aid. And so that I think is a really important step forward that we've seen on the F-16s, the announcement that's come out of the summit there. What I would like to see, though, and I know some further sanctions were announced, is that we've not seen any prescription of the Wagner Group here in the UK, and that's something that my party has been calling for. And we know that they're obviously heavily involved in the conflict in Bakhmut at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Henry, I mean, in terms of the sort of ongoing conflict with Ukraine, I mean, Britain is standing very firm and pledging support, as are many sort of Western democracies. But certainly many military commentators are now saying that there's no easy or quick end in sight. I mean, if this conflict goes on indefinitely, how difficult is that support going to be to sustain?
So it depends on the form it takes, but the problem that a lot of Western countries have, including Britain, is that our military industrial complexes just aren't set up for high intensity conflict of this sort. And so what happens is, we're sending Ukraine, we're all sending Ukraine weapons, but that means we're sending Ukraine a real pick and mix of different sorts of equipment, all of which need different replacement parts, different training, often different ammunition. And we also don't have the capacity to manufacture that ammunition to the scale that's required for this kind of war. So regardless of whether or not the political will is there, which I think it definitely is, it does start testing and putting strain on our supplies. And you see this elsewhere as well. It's been suggested in some quarters that some of our reluctance to send over bits of allegedly surplus equipment to Ukraine is basically about disguising whether or not that is functional. The United Kingdom is also historically quite bad at military procurement. So if we send key bits of kit to Ukraine, the question is, how quickly could we replace that kit for the British Armed Forces and at what cost? So, yes, it is. I don't think political will is going to crack. We had a winter, we had Russia unleashing its energy weapon. We've withstood it so far. I think that the difficulty is going to be practical, which is if we have a large-scale conventional war, which is consuming material at a rate which we have just not experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else, are we geared up, or can we get ourselves geared up to keep providing that vital equipment?
And just one final point, Henry, I want to put to you. I mean, it's interesting if you look and see what's happened with Syria and the sort of, the local sort of geopolitics have kind of welcomed Bashar al-Assad back into the fold. He has been invited back into sort of meetings and diplomacy and all of that, despite the horrendous things he's done in Syria. There are some who worry that President Putin might sort of take some encouragement from that and think, right, I'll sit it out. Eventually, look at Assad, they'll bring me back in.
So obviously Ukraine is on the West's radar in a way that Syria never has been. And I think it's very difficult to imagine a circumstance unless some kind of peace settlement was sanctified by the Ukrainians that Russia would have any prospect of that. But what I think that the situation with the Arab League does show is that outside the West, this idea of Russia as the great anathema is not necessarily strong currency, and it might be that if he can win and establish, or not win but establish a strong position, we might lock him out. But as you mentioned, China and other authoritarian regimes around the world might row in behind him.
Yeah, the shifts in geopolitics are fascinating and very worrying as well.